Yes, I don't want to be too loud.
How's that?
That's great.
All right. It is my pleasure to introduce Melissa Lamberton-Sevigny. I thought I'd begin by returning to Mel and Chris a loaned item that Emiko and I should have given back to them quite some time ago. Dr. Quinn Medicine Woman. I thought I'd start with bringing those back because the actual shows themselves and the fact that I have their copies in my hand really sums up how I feel about Mel. Like Dr. Quinn, she is wholesome, loving, family-oriented, sorry, too loud, I won't shout, dynamic, loves the West, has a passion for social and environmental justice, and to me is just so real and so genuine. Clearly, I also think very highly of Dr. Quinn. Mel is also a person who not only admits to liking Dr. Quinn as a child, which some people won't even admit, but who has also bought all of the seasons to watch as an adult. Furthermore, she's lent me several of the seasons so that I can watch them and then discuss them with her thereafter. If that were not enough, she and Chris have lent me other TV shows, movies, young adult books, a copy of her portfolio to get through English 500, tools, and even mice traps to catch those little critters in my kitchen, which incidentally is yet another item I need to return to them. It is also so like Mel that often she thinks of these things to lend or give me without my even asking. For example, somehow it came up that my partner Emiko had gone through a winter in Iowa with no coat. Mel, a few weeks later, said she had two and that we should absolutely have the other one. And let me tell you, this was a very nice coat to be giving away. Mel has also shown her generosity by putting me up in her guest room once a week for 2 straight years. And for me, this has been infinitely more meaningful than just a place to stay and a bed. In part, this is because I've really gotten to know Mel a lot better over these last 2 years. And also because often the nights I spent at their house turned out to be a high point in my week. I wish all of you could experience what it's like to spend a quiet, lovely evening with the Sevignys. They are warm and inviting. They'll always feed you. You'll play Settlers of Catan, even color an Easter Bunny coloring book, decorate their Christmas tree, and share many laughs. Mel might even let you try on her wedding dress as you prepare for your own wedding. Thank you, Mel. I also just found out this morning that they bought me a gift of my favorite berry basil jam, which I had actually finished their entire bottle at their house, so really I should be the one buying them a refill of the bottle. And again, just showing the type of people that Mel and Chris are. So pretty much you can see I think Mel is a saint and the epitome of generosity. After all of these stories, I should at least tell you a little bit about her writing and her career. For the past 2 years, Mel has worked as a communications research assistant at the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture. She's published numerous articles for them, and her other writing work includes creative nonfiction, often with an investigative journalism bent, as well as poetry. I've seen her resume, and she has a whole host of publications and presentations. Pages and pages of them, actually. And I'm sure she'd humbly say that these are just minor publications and itty-bitty, places that she sent them. But that's just because she's a very humble person, and I was extremely impressed with this long list, and I think it speaks to how hard she works and the quality of her writing. Her thesis this year, which you'll soon have the pleasure of hearing, won the Research Excellence Award for the scientific, that she incorporated into her writing. I think you'll find, as I always have with Mel's writing, that she achieves such a lyrical voice in her nonfiction and has an impressive ability to bring scenes and history alive in her texts. Well, I hope I have done her justice because she has been such a wonderful, generous friend, and she deserves the warmest of welcomes.
Introductions every year just so that the third years have to spend like the rest of their lives living up to it. A few days ago, some of the third years were sitting around talking about a list of questions that people were not allowed to ask us this weekend. We had aside for like safe topics too, and I think we only came up with like cats and food. But the top of the list of things not to ask us was, what is your thesis about? As a result, I have no very clear, succinct way of describing what my thesis is about. It's a nonfiction book of essays about Arizona, where I grew up, and I talk about diminishing water supplies in the Colorado River Basin, and this kind of mindset we have there that if we need water, we'll just make it appear at will. And against that, I talk about real rivers and acts of restoration with those rivers. The bit I'm going to read today is a few slices of my thesis about the canal that brings water to my hometown. And we built this canal because we mined the aquifers beneath us until there really wasn't much left. And I also talk about the place where I grew up and the arroyo behind my house. I'm told I need to define this term arroyo. It's a water-carved gully that's dry most of the year, and it usually flows just once or twice when it rains. All right. After a storm, the dark basalt stones that made a jagged path down to the arroyo turned treacherous and slick. I clutched a Tupperware bowl, and my father held the flashlight. The rush of storm water that tore down the arroyo had vanished hours ago, but in the circle of light we could still see boulders cupping round pools. Male spadefoot toads flexed their full-bodied voices, calling for a mate with an urgency I only dimly understood at the age of 8 or 9. That rhythmic, overlapping crick, croak, crick rang out with a major chord of earnest love-making and a minor chord of desperation. Most of the puddles would be gone by morning. The deepest might last a week. As soon as storm clouds spread dark sails over the Catalina Mountains, my sisters and I pressed our faces against the windows and waited for this ritual. Thunder called the splay-footed toads out of the sand, and we'd find bundles of eggs streaming every which way in the puddles, pale, jelly-like globes with one black dot in the center. I gathered a pyramid-shaped strand into the Tupperware and left the rest to their fate. Following some signal known only to themselves, the black dots would wiggle free like commas slipping from a page. They grew legs as quick as they could. Sometimes they died. I'd seen the parched bodies pool together at the deepest point in a sandy hollow. But not these ones, I thought fiercely, clutching my strand of eggs. Each summer we watched eggs turn to tadpoles and tadpoles to toads, an aquarium-sized miracle that never failed to fill me with wonder. The little spadefoots had enormous personalities. They corkscrewed backward into the soil when they went to sleep and squinched their gorgeous golden eyes tight shut to swallow. We let most of them loose the next time the arroyo flowed, though a few became hungry household fixtures, round and fat as gumballs. We named them after fairy tales: Pin, Princess, Jimmy, Jade, characters from a children's story. They shared their tank with a tiger salamander, Sally, who spent her days gazing hopefully at the sky from which pillbugs and grubs mysteriously descended. We might have been the only girls in the neighborhood who spent our afternoons digging in the compost pile for worms. I lived at the delta of the Colorado River. Its final destination since I turned 6 years old, among other equally unlikely destinations, has been the city of Tucson. When I turned on the tap, not merely bent molecules of hydrogen and oxygen tumbled down the pipes like jumping jacks. It was the Colorado itself, muddy brown and roaring, the wayward river that carved the Grand Canyon and upturned its silt at the Great Delta in Mexico, pressed into service to fill my bathtub, water my garden, and stew my Earl Grey, a tempest in a teapot. The Central Arizona Project, the 336-mile-long canal that brings water from the Colorado River to my hometown, shimmered on the horizons of my childhood with exactly the same shade of blue as a heat-induced mirage. No river flows uphill. No river belongs in these cracked creosote flats. Yet I knew that water rippling through the cement-lined ditch scaled a 2,000-foot elevation change on its journey to Tucson, moving stepwise through 14 pumping plants, a mythical river made real. This is how you make a river flow uphill. Start with coal, lots of it. The coal comes from Black Mesa, a broad ring of plateaus and valleys in northern Arizona where an ancient Pleistocene lake once swallowed waterlogged trees, dead mammoths, and the enormous decaying frills of ferns. Black Mesa took these brittle remains into its belly, back into the womb of the world, and pressed them between layers of sandstone. Surveyors reported to Washington, D.C., seams of coal gleaming in the sheer banks carved by arroyos. Around the same time, a rising tide of homesteaders flooded the West to claim 160 acres of free land. President Arthur had a simple solution to keep coal out of private hands. He established Black Mesa as a reservation for the Navajo and Hopi tribes. The Peabody Western Coal Company began mining on land leased from the tribes in 1968. The company does not burrow into the earth to find seams of coal. It simply flays the land open in long strips, removing trees, topsoil, stones, and lichen alike. Most of the coal lights up Las Vegas, Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Tucson. The remainder, nearly 2 million tons annually, powers the Central Arizona Project. Once you figure coal into the mix, the canal begins to look something like a snake eating its own tail. Scientists predict that the Colorado's flows will diminish 10 to 20% by mid-century, a change driven by global reliance on fossil fuels. In short, the canal's energy source is contributing to a stranglehold on its water supply. Newly married, I left Tucson in the cab of a pickup truck, retracing the familiar route to the coastline, but this time with no certainty of coming back. We headed north, towards my husband's home country in the upper Midwest, into the promise of rivers that flow all year long. When I returned that Christmas with my husband Chris and my new sister-in-law Amanda, I returned as a tourist. We did all of the things that tourists do. We hiked the Finger Rock Trail into the Catalina Mountains amid rare flurries of snow whispering into vapor. Other hikers greeted us on the trail, hatless and damp, commenting on the cold snap with a cheeriness only a Tucsonian could muster. We visited the mission at San Javier del Bac, and though I had seen those shining white walls rise from beige desert scrub dozens of times on the highway south of town, I had never gone inside. Tohono women flipped fry bread in enormous barrel drums brimming with hot oil, such a strange conflation of culture that I found it hard to leave the parking lot. The mission, founded in 1692, had recently been renovated with a time-honored mix of lime, sand, and prickly pear pulp, and burnished bright by river cobbles. This is a crossroads, a meeting place. American tourists, Spanish mission, Navajo tacos made with Anglo-introduced flour, and behind it all, Owatam fields stitching the desert in green. This is also the end point of the Central Arizona Project Canal, though that was far from the politicians' minds when they dreamed of the canal nearly a century ago. The old saying goes that water flows uphill towards power and money, and that goes for underground too. Tucson's reliance on aquifers sucked groundwater from beneath the San Javier district of the Tohono Nation, killing the long corridors of cottonwood trees that once graced the riverbanks. We repaid the debt, at least on paper, with CAP water. Owatam farmers now water squash and beans with a portion of the Colorado and pour the rest of their share into the Santa Cruz River to restore the wetlands and revive the cottonwood trees. In the warm interior of the tiny church, I felt clearly how our lives, right down to the things we hold sacred, shape themselves to the things that we build. Living on the banks of a dry arroyo taught me reverence for water, but the canal reversed that lesson. Water is only a commodity, a thing to buy and sell. My mind drifted back to that question: what other ways could it have gone? Without the canal, Arizonans might have mined the aquifers until the earth gave way beneath us. Or we might have learned to use less and love more the blessing of the inconstant desert. In the end, like all questions that revolve around water, the long-distance transportation of a resource is a matter of ethics. We saved Tucson's last cottonwood trees only to displace the mining of aquifers to tribal lands in northern Arizona, out of sight. We tamed the Colorado only to starve it with climate change. We built a city, my city, entirely reliant on the water nobody needed. This is the price of constancy, the hidden cost of unhinging ourselves from the joyous swing between rain and drought, abundance and scarcity, which always defines a desert. At present, nobody talks about local water the way we've begun to talk about local food. Arizonans have convinced ourselves that the desert cannot provide enough and built lies that make it true. But all I can think of is my joy when the arroyo behind my childhood home flashed into flood and the spadefoots began to sing. In the desert, water is always a gift. I find myself opening my hands for something I didn't purchase, earn, or create, something that pours out of the sky in pure, undeserved grace.